April 18th, 1942, somewhere in the North Pacific. Rain lashed the deck of the USS Hornet, wind howling across the endless gray sea. On its flight deck sat 16 twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers, planes never meant to take off from an aircraft carrier. And inside those planes sat 80 young Americans, all volunteers for a mission that no one expected to return from. Just 4 months earlier, Japan had struck Pearl Harbor. America had been humiliated, its fleet burning, its people enraged. Now, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, these men were about to strike back, not for victory, but for vengeance and hope. Their orders were simple and suicidal. Fly more than 600 miles to bomb Tokyo. Then, if fuel allowed, continue west toward China. No rescue. No return. As the carrier turned into the wind, one pilot whispered, "If this is it, let's make it count." Engines roared. Propellers screamed. One by one, the bombers leapt into the storm and into history. Because sometimes the most dangerous missions aren't meant to be survived. They're meant to remind the world that America would never kneel. Stay with us. As we return to the day, 80 men flew into the heart of the empire with no way home. April 1st, 1942, Washington, D.C. In a small, windowless room inside the Navy building, a handful of men gathered around a map of the Pacific. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and silence. For months had passed since Pearl Harbor. America was still reeling. Ships lay rusting in the harbor, and morale was at rock bottom. The Japanese empire stretched from the Philippines to Burma. And every headline screamed the same thing. Where will America strike back? No one had an answer until Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle walked in. Doolittle was no ordinary officer. He was a racing pilot, a daredevil scientist, and one of America's most decorated aviators. To him, the word impossible was a challenge. He studied the map, then looked up. "We hit Tokyo." The room went silent. Someone scoffed, "Sir, that's 2,000 miles from the nearest base." Doolittle's response was quiet, calm, and terrifying. "Then we'll bring the base to them." At Pier 41, workers loaded strange cargo onto the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. CV-8, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, their wings nearly scraping the island tower. No one outside the operation knew why. To most sailors, the sight was absurd. Those bombers were Army aircraft, never designed for carrier use. They were too big, too heavy, and had no arresting hooks. Even the Hornet's captain, Mark Mitcher, stared in disbelief. "How the hell do you plan to get them off the deck?" Doolittle smiled. "We'll take off. We just won't be coming back." The Hornet sailed in silence, escorted by the carrier USS Enterprise and a screen of destroyers. The task force's code name, Task Force 16. The weather was cruel, waves taller than trucks, the deck slick with salt and wind. Below deck, the pilots slept in cramped bunks, writing letters they would never send. Lieutenant Richard Dick Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, recalled years later. "We knew it was one way. There wasn't enough gas to come back. But no one complained. We just wanted to do something, anything to hit back." On the Hornet's deck, under a pale moon, Doolittle gathered his men. They stood shoulder to shoulder, airmen, navigators, gunners, some barely 22 years old. He looked at them and said, "Tomorrow we bomb Tokyo. You all know the risk. If anyone wants out, step forward now." No one moved, not a single man. They knew the odds. Even if they reached Japan, they'd have to fly another 1,200 miles to China with barely enough fuel for 800. And if they ran out, they'd crash in the sea or in the mountains, or be captured. Doolittle nodded. "Then let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we make history." The sea boiled with gray mist. Suddenly, the lookout's cry shattered the silence. Enemy patrol vessel spotted, bearing 270 degrees. A Japanese fishing boat, the Nidomaru, had sighted them. They sank it immediately, but it was too late. Tokyo had been alerted. Doolittle made a decision that would change history. The plan had been to launch 450 miles from Japan. But now they were 650 miles out, far beyond safe range. He turned to Captain Mitcher. "We launch now, before they find us again." Mitcher hesitated. The deck was pitching hard. Wind screamed across the bow. Even Navy pilots struggled to take off in these conditions, and Doolittle's men were Army flyers. But there was no other choice. Doolittle climbed into B-25 #40-2344, the first bomber in line. The carrier's deck stretched just 467 feet, barely the length of a football field. Waves slammed against the bow as engines roared to life. The crew braced. Flaps down. Throttle full. The Hornet turned into the wind. A sailor waved his flag. Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber thundered forward, wheels bumping over wet steel. Halfway down the deck, a gust nearly lifted one wing. The men on deck held their breath. At the very edge, the nose dipped. Then the plane rose into the storm. Cheers erupted. The impossible had just happened. One by one, 15 more bombers followed, each takeoff a leap of faith into the unknown. 16 black silhouettes disappeared into the gray horizon. The sea grew quiet again, the Hornet turning back towards safety. But for Doolittle's men, there was no safety, only a long, uncertain road to Tokyo. Inside the cockpits, the air was freezing, the engines trembling. Each crew had a single map, a handful of rations, and a prayer. Below them, thousands of miles of water. Ahead, the Empire of Japan. Lieutenant Cole looked out his window and said softly, "If we don't make it back, at least they'll know we tried." No one had ever done what these men were doing. No GPS, no radio guidance, no guarantee they'd even reach land. Every mile flown was borrowed time. Every heartbeat, a countdown. But this was more than a mission. It was America's message to the world, that even in its darkest hour, it would not bow. The Doolittle Raiders didn't just fly toward Tokyo. They flew into legend. April 18th, 1942, 11:45 a.m., over the Pacific. The sun burned through the clouds as 16 B-25s roared westward, engines straining, fuel gauges already sinking. Inside each bomber, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, flying the lead plane, checked his compass. The coastline of Japan was just over the horizon. They had been in the air for nearly 4 hours, flying low over churning seas, dodging fishing boats and radar lines. His navigator, Lieutenant Henry Potter, looked up from his charts. "Sir, we're approaching landfall." Doolittle leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then let's give them something they'll never forget." The first outlines of Japan came into view. Green fields, small villages, smoke rising from chimneys. Civilians going about their lives, unaware that American bombers were bearing down on them. Tokyo, the heart of the empire, lay less than 100 miles ahead. But Japan's defenses were on high alert. The early warning from the Nidomaru had already reached command posts. Anti-aircraft batteries stood ready. Fighter squadrons scrambled from bases outside the capital. Still, the B-25s flew low, hugging the treetops. Their engines echoed like distant thunder. Inside one bomber, a gunner muttered, "God forgive us for what we're about to do." For the first time in over 1,000 years, Japan's capital was about to come under foreign attack. Factories hummed with production. Mitsubishi, Nakajima, Kawasaki, churning out aircraft and engines for the Imperial Army. Trains clattered down iron rails. Schoolchildren practiced air drills they thought they'd never need. Then, the city heard a sound no one recognized, the deep, rolling drone of twin radial engines. Office workers looked up from their desks. Mothers stepped onto balconies. A few pointed at the sky, black crosses approaching through the clouds. Moments later, Doolittle's bomber broke through the haze and thundered over Tokyo Bay. Bomb bay doors open. The first payload, 4 500-pound bombs, fell toward the industrial district of Shiba. Seconds later, the ground erupted in flame and smoke. The shockwave rippled through the city. Japan's capital, once thought untouchable, was burning. The other B-25s came roaring in from different directions. Major Travis Hoover hit Tokyo's docks. Captain David Jones struck military warehouses. Lieutenant Ted Lawson bombed the steelworks and arsenal plants. while others dropped leaflets warning Japan. "We will never forget Pearl Harbor." Air raid sirens screamed. Civilians ran for shelter as anti-aircraft guns opened fire, shells bursting in the sky. But the Japanese gunners were too slow, too stunned. The bombers were already gone. At one point, Captain Ross Greening's B-25 was chased by two Japanese Zero fighters. He dropped altitude so low that his bomber's propellers sliced through telephone wires. The Zeros overshot, unable to maneuver that close to the ground. Another crew, Captain York's, found themselves over Yokohama, dropping bombs on oil refineries before escaping into clouds. The damage was small compared to later raids, but psychologically, it was immense. Tokyo had been violated. The Emperor's city was not safe. The bombers regrouped loosely, turning southwest toward the East China Sea. They had completed their mission, but now came the impossible part, getting home. The men watched the fuel gauges with silent dread. They had launched 200 miles farther than planned. Every drop of fuel now meant the difference between life and death. Doolittle radioed to the group. "Proceed individually. Each man on his own. There will be no escorts, no guiding path. Only open water and faith." As they crossed the coast of Honshu, Japanese anti-aircraft fire intensified. Shells burst around them, flak peppering the wings. One plane, Lieutenant Hallmark's, was hit in the tail but managed to keep flying. Still, none of the 16 bombers turned back. Every man pressed on toward China, knowing they wouldn't have enough fuel to reach safety. The clouds grew thick and dark. Rain began to fall. Radio silence descended across the formation. Lieutenant Cole recalled, "It was just the sound of engines and time running out." Each crew calculated their remaining fuel. An hour, maybe two. Some began throwing out anything heavy, machine guns, radios, even extra clothing. In one bomber, a crewman took out his pistol, looked at it, and quietly slipped it into his boot. If captured, he knew what awaited them. After nearly 14 hours in the air, the first crews spotted land, the dark outline of the Chinese coast. But it wasn't the relief they hoped for. They were still 200 miles from their intended airfield, and the weather had turned savage. Rain slammed against the canopies. Visibility dropped to zero. Mountains loomed somewhere ahead, unseen and deadly. Doolittle looked at his fuel gauge. It read empty. He turned to his crew. "Prepare to bail out." They nodded silently. At 9:20 p.m., after nearly 13 hours of flight, Doolittle's plane ran dry over Jiangxi province. He ordered the crew out. One by one, they leapt into the freezing black night, vanishing into the storm. All 16 bombers had launched. 15 reached China. One, low on fuel, diverted to Vladivostok, where it was seized by the Soviets. The others fell out of the sky, some in mountains, others in rice fields. Parachutes opened in darkness, men crashing through trees and roofs. Some broke bones. Some are never seen again. But most survived, thanks to Chinese villagers who risked their lives to hide the Americans from Japanese patrols. Those same villagers would pay dearly for their kindness. Japan's retribution would come swift and brutal, a tragedy the world would not learn of for years. As the fires in Tokyo died down that night, Emperor Hirohito's advisors gathered in silence. The raid had done little material damage, but it shattered the illusion of safety. Japan's military command was humiliated. They vowed revenge, and that revenge would soon fall upon China and lead Japan into the trap that would destroy its navy at Midway. Doolittle, meanwhile, believed the mission had been a failure. His plane lost, his men scattered, some captured. He feared court-martial. Instead, he returned home to a nation that hailed him as a hero. But that moment would come later. For now, 80 men were alone, deep behind enemy lines, each one wondering if morning would ever come. April 19th, 1942, early morning. The sun rose slowly over the misty hills of eastern China. Villagers in Jiangxi province awoke to the echo of distant thunder, but it wasn't thunder. It was the sound of American bombers falling from the sky. One by one, 15 B-25s had run out of fuel after the raid on Tokyo. Some crashed into rice fields. Some vanished into the mountains, and some ended in fire. Scattered across hundreds of miles, the men of Doolittle's raiders were alone, injured, and behind enemy lines. The mission that began as a symbol of vengeance had become a desperate struggle for survival. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, Jiangxi Province. Rain poured through the black night as Doolittle fell through the clouds, his parachute opening only seconds before impact. He hit a slope, rolled, and lost consciousness. When he woke, dawn had broken. His face was scraped, his ankle twisted, but he was alive. He looked up to see a group of Chinese farmers staring at him, wide-eyed and silent. They didn't know who he was, but they saw the American flag patch on his sleeve. The villagers helped him up, carrying him to a hut hidden in the bamboo forests. They gave him rice porridge, wrapped his ankle, and whispered prayers. Doolittle asked, "Have you seen any other airmen?" They nodded. "Many. From the sky. They fall like rain." He closed his eyes. The mission wasn't over. It was scattered across China, waiting to be found. Captain Ted Lawson, near Ningbo, China. Lawson's bomber, the ruptured duck, had crashed violently after hitting the sea near the coast. The impact shattered the nose of the plane. Lawson's jaw was broken, his leg torn open. His crew dragged him out as the bomber sank beneath the waves. They stumbled ashore, bleeding, exhausted, and half-conscious. Chinese fishermen spotted them and pulled them to safety, hiding them from nearby Japanese patrols. Lawson drifted in and out of delirium for days, his face swollen beyond recognition. Later, when rescued by missionaries, he remembered one thing. The villagers who shielded them refused any payment, saying only, "You came to fight the enemy. We will fight for you." Across provinces like Zhejiang, Jiangxi, and Hunan, the wreckage of the Doolittle raid littered the countryside. Crewmen were found hanging from trees, tangled in parachutes. Some lay unconscious in rivers or rice paddies. Villagers risked execution to carry them to safety, often moving them at night through mountain passes. But the Japanese army was already closing in. Their aircraft scoured the skies. Their infantry marched village to village, demanding to know where the American demons had fallen. When Japanese command realized that Chinese civilians had rescued the American airmen, their response was merciless. By June 1942, the Japanese launched Operation Seigo, also known as the Jiangxi Campaign. Their goal: annihilate every town suspected of helping the raiders. What followed was one of the most brutal acts of retaliation in the Pacific War. Entire villages were burned. Wells were poisoned. Hospitals were raided and doctors executed for treating Americans. Over 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed. The Japanese army even tested biological weapons, spreading cholera and plague in the region, a war crime the world would not uncover until decades later. For the men of the Doolittle raid, survival came at a terrible price. They would live, but thousands who had saved them would not. After days of wandering, starvation, and hiding, small groups of survivors finally made contact with Chinese nationalist troops. They were escorted to Chongqing, the wartime capital of China. When Doolittle arrived, he expected arrest. He told a fellow officer, "We lost every plane. We lost some of our men. I guess the mission was a failure." But as he limped into the hall, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek himself came forward to greet him. He clasped Doolittle's hand and said, "You have done more than you can know. You have awakened hope in all of China." Word spread across Asia that America had struck back, that the rising sun was not invincible, and that courage still lived in the hearts of men. The captured crews, prisoners of the Empire. 8 of the Doolittle raiders were captured by the Japanese after crash landing or being betrayed. They were taken to Shanghai, interrogated, and tortured for months. The Japanese military demanded confessions. None came. In October 1942, after a secret trial, 3 of the prisoners, Lieutenants Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz, were executed by firing squad. Their last words were prayers for their families and for America. Another, Lieutenant Meader, died from starvation in captivity. The remaining 4 endured over 3 years of imprisonment, surviving disease, beatings, and solitary confinement until liberation in 1945. When they returned home, they could barely speak of what they had endured. One survivor later said, "They broke our bodies, but not our souls. We flew for the men we lost." Back in Japan, the shock of the raid consumed the imperial general staff. The emperor demanded answers. How could American bombers have reached Tokyo undetected? The Navy blamed the Army. The Army blamed the Navy. But one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, saw what others did not. He understood the psychological blow this raid had dealt to Japan's people and government, and he knew only one way to restore faith in the empire: by destroying America's carriers once and for all. So, he began planning an ambitious strike to lure the U.S. Navy into battle and crush it. That plan would become the Battle of Midway, the turning point of the entire Pacific War. For the 80 men who had volunteered, the Doolittle raid had begun as vengeance. It ended as legend, paid for in blood, courage, and sacrifice. Some came home heroes. Some never came home at all. But each one had flown knowing the odds, accepting death as the price for defiance. And though their bombs caused limited physical damage, their mission shattered the myth of Japanese invulnerability and lit a spark of hope across the Allied world. May 1942, Tokyo, Japan. The city still smelled of smoke. Charred buildings lined the streets, their roofs caved in, their windows shattered. Children walked past blackened ruins, clutching their schoolbooks. Japan had been humiliated, and the wound ran deeper than any bomb crater. For centuries, the Japanese homeland had been considered untouchable, shielded by the sea and by destiny. But now, America had proven otherwise. 16 bombers, flying from nowhere, had defied the empire. The raid had killed fewer than 100 people. But in the heart of Japan, it shattered something far more vital: the illusion of safety. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito listened in silence as his generals described the damage. They tried to downplay it, but even the emperor could see fear in their eyes. The unthinkable had happened, and fear was contagious. In a heavily guarded conference room in Tokyo, Japan's military leaders argued into the night. The air crackled with anger. General Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister of Japan, slammed his fist on the table. "The Americans struck our capital. How could we let this happen?" The Navy officers, red-faced and exhausted, blamed the Army for failing to detect the task force. The Army accused the Navy of incompetence and arrogance. But one man stayed silent: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. When he finally spoke, the room fell quiet. "The Doolittle raid has changed everything," Yamamoto said. "They have proven they can reach us. Our people will demand revenge." He looked down at a map of the Pacific, his finger tracing the blue expanse between Japan and Hawaii. "We must destroy their carriers, all of them, before they strike again." That single sentence set into motion the next great battle of the Pacific, Midway. May 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Across the ocean, inside the reconstructed naval base at Pearl Harbor, the news of Doolittle's success ignited something else: hope. Sailors cheered when the reports arrived. Pilots saluted Doolittle's photo pinned on mess hall walls. The message spread like wildfire across the Pacific. Tokyo has been bombed. America has struck back. For the first time since December 7, 1941, the U.S. Navy felt the tide might finally turn. Rear Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, studied the situation carefully. He knew Japan would not let this insult go unanswered. He knew they'd come, and he intended to be ready. "They'll try to lure us into a trap," Nimitz said quietly. "But this time, we'll know it's coming." Tokyo, late May 1942. Admiral Yamamoto worked day and night on the blueprint for what he called Operation MI, a decisive strike at Midway Atoll, a small island halfway between Hawaii and Japan. His plan was bold. Send 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, to attack Midway. Draw out the American fleet. Crush their remaining carriers in one swift blow. Yamamoto believed the Americans were still reeling, their morale fragile, their strength broken. He had no idea that U.S. intelligence had already cracked Japan's naval code, Jan 25, and knew exactly where and when he planned to strike. The Americans were preparing a trap of their own. The echoes of the Doolittle raid had not faded. Across China, Japanese retribution grew fiercer each day. Towns accused of sheltering American airmen were wiped off the map. Missionaries were executed. Entire families were buried alive. In a small village near Tsuzhou, an old farmer who had hidden Doolittle's men was forced to watch as his home was burned to the ground. He whispered, "They brought hope. Hope is worth dying for." For the Americans who survived, this knowledge would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Doolittle raiders would later learn that their survival had cost 250,000 Chinese lives. Some of them would break down in tears when they found out. They hadn't known. They couldn't have known. But war never spares the innocent. In the capital, President Franklin D. Roosevelt read the classified reports of the raid's aftermath. He understood the cost, but he also knew the mission had accomplished something invaluable. Morale had risen. America had proven it could strike the enemy's heart. Factories that had slowed after Pearl Harbor now surged with production. Men lined up at recruitment offices. The president met Doolittle at the White House in May. When Doolittle walked in, limping slightly, Roosevelt smiled. "Colonel, you've given this country the first good news of the war." He then promoted Doolittle on the spot, from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. But Doolittle didn't smile. He replied quietly, "Sir, I didn't bring them all home." Roosevelt looked at him and said, "You brought America back to its feet. That's enough." From the inland sea, Yamamoto's great armada began to move. For carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Sailors bowed before the imperial flag as the ships departed. They believed this operation would decide the war, that Japan would once again prove its divine destiny. But Yamamoto knew, deep down, that the Doolittle raid had forced his hand too early. The Americans had provoked him, and now he was marching straight into their trap. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Yamato, and said to his staff, "The enemy has tasted blood. We must make them choke on it." As the Japanese fleet advanced toward Midway, thousands of miles away, 3 American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, waited in silence. The same Hornet that had launched Doolittle's bombers now prepared to finish what they had started. Pilots checked their planes, mechanics tightened bolts, and deck crews whispered among themselves. The sea was calm, deceptively calm. Everyone knew that within hours, history would be written again. The spirit of Doolittle's raiders was alive on those decks. A quiet reminder that courage could turn fear into fury, and that a handful of men could change the course of an empire. The Doolittle raid was more than a daring strike. It was a spark that set the Pacific ablaze. It forced Japan to gamble everything at Midway, and gave America the chance to strike back with precision and power. What began as a one-way flight into the unknown had become a catalyst for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The raiders had risked everything for a single message, and now that message was echoing across the Pacific. The Empire of Japan could bleed. June 4th, 1942, dawned over the Pacific. A calm blue sea stretched endlessly in every direction. But beneath that calm, 2 mighty fleets were moving toward each other, one driven by vengeance, the other by faith. To the Japanese, this was supposed to be the final act. The Battle of Midway would crush America's carriers and erase the shame of the Doolittle raid. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had promised his emperor nothing less than total victory. But fate, like the sea, has its own currents. American intelligence had already broken Japan's Jan 25 naval code, thanks to months of cryptanalysis at Station HYPO in Hawaii. Commander Joseph Rockefeller and his team had deciphered just enough to identify the target, AF, as Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz made a daring decision. Instead of waiting to be attacked, he would ambush the ambushers. 3 carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown took position northeast of Midway, hidden beneath heavy clouds. It was a gamble built on fragments of intelligence and faith in courage. They hit Tokyo, Nimitz told his staff. Now we hit back hard. Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched their first wave, 108 planes, to bomb Midway's airfield. The sunrise glowed red over their decks, the crews confident, calm, unaware that American eyes were already watching. On Midway Island, radar screens began to buzz. Bogies inbound, distance 93 miles. Defenders scrambled into the air. Marine wildcats and buffaloes, thinly armed, outnumbered but determined. They fought desperately as bombs rained down, tearing craters into the coral runways. It was chaos, smoke, fire, and the roar of engines, but Midway held. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Chuchi Nagumo received reports of damage to Midway's installations. His first strike had succeeded, but not destroyed everything. He prepared a second wave. Then came another report. Enemy ships sighted northeast of Midway. Nagumo hesitated. Should he reload his bombers with torpedoes to attack ships, or stay with land bombs for a second strike? That single hesitation would decide the fate of Japan's fleet. While his crew frantically switched munitions below decks, torpedoes, bombs, and fuel scattered across the hangars. American dive bombers were already closing in. The U.S. launched 3 separate attacks, torpedo squadrons flying low, braving enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. They were massacred. Out of 41 torpedo planes, 35 were shot down. Pilots burned, drowned, or vanished beneath the waves. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. They had pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the skies above unguarded. At 10:22 a.m., 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown broke through the clouds. They found the Japanese carriers exposed, decks cluttered with refueling planes, bombs, and torpedoes. From 15,000 feet, they dove. Wind screamed through their canopies. Dive, dive, dive. One by one, they released their payloads. 500-pound bombs plunged into steel decks, igniting fuel lines, detonating ordnance, setting off-chain explosions that tore through the ships. In less than 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in fire. Columns of smoke rose miles into the sky. Japanese sailors leapt into the sea, the water turning black with oil. The Empire's proud carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were dying. Only one Japanese carrier remained, Hiryu. Her commander, Taman Yamaguchi, refused to surrender. He launched a counterattack against the Yorktown, striking it twice with bombs and torpedoes. The Yorktown burned fiercely but refused to sink. Her crew fought the flames for hours, patching holes, keeping her afloat. A floating symbol of American defiance. Later that afternoon, U.S. bombers found the Hiryu and returned the favor. 2 direct hits set her ablaze from bow to stern. By sunset, she too slipped beneath the waves. The battle raged for 2 more days, but the outcome was already sealed. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, destroyed. Over 3,000 sailors lost. Hundreds of aircraft gone. The Imperial Navy, once unstoppable, had been shattered. In contrast, the U.S. lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and 307 men. A terrible cost, but one that changed the balance of power in the Pacific forever. When news of the victory reached Washington, Roosevelt simply said, "This is our revenge for Pearl Harbor." Tokyo, June 1942. Admiral Yamamoto received the news in stunned silence aboard his flagship, Yamato. He stood on the deck, staring into the horizon. The Doolittle raid, the mission that had embarrassed Japan, had forced him to attack prematurely. He had overreached, underestimated America, and lost everything he'd built. He whispered to his aide, "We have awakened a sleeping giant," and filled him with a terrible resolve. Those were the same words he had predicted before Pearl Harbor, and now they had come true. At dawn, American sailors stood at attention as the news spread across the base. The ghosts of December 7th had been avenged. But among the cheers, there was also silence. A solemn understanding of what had begun at Pearl Harbor and what had been answered by the men of the Doolittle raid. They were the spark that lit this fire. The proof that courage could turn humiliation into victory. The USS Hornet, which had once carried 16 bombers into the storm, was now the silent witness to Japan's undoing. The Battle of Midway was not just a triumph of strategy. It was a victory born from sacrifice. From 80 men who took off from a carrier with no return plan, to hundreds who died in the waves of Midway. Each had played a part in rewriting the course of history. The Doolittle raid had been a message, and Midway was its answer. It proved that even when hope seemed lost, a handful of men with courage could tilt the balance of the world. April 1942, China's coastline. The storm that had carried 16 bombers toward Japan now tore them apart on their desperate flight west. Fuel gauges sank to zero. Engines coughed, sputtered, and died one by one. The pilots knew there would be no landing strips waiting for them, no friendly beacons shining through the night. All they had were black skies, rising mountains, and the faint hope of surviving the crash. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 ran dry over the coast. He ordered his crew to bail out into the rain-soaked darkness. As he fell through the air, he wondered if his mission had been a failure. He would later admit, "I thought it was the end of my career." But it was not. It was the beginning of America's roar. Villagers awoke to the sound of engines sputtering overhead, followed by explosions in the distance. One after another, American bombers crash-landed or broke apart in the fields. Chinese farmers rushed toward the wreckage, not to capture, but to rescue. Bleeding, burned, half-conscious pilots were carried to safety by peasants who couldn't even speak their language, but understood their courage. Thousands of Chinese civilians would die for that act of kindness, massacred by the Japanese army during brutal retaliation campaigns. Entire villages were wiped out because they had dared to help the Doolittle raiders. Of the 80 men who took off that morning, 77 survived the raid itself. But for 8 of them, the nightmare was far from over. Captured by the Japanese in China, they were tortured and starved. 3 were executed, their bodies never recovered. 1 died of disease in captivity. The remaining 4 endured 3 long years in prison cells until liberation in 1945. They had volunteered knowing they might never return. And for some, that became the price of history. The raid had done limited physical damage, but its psychological impact was catastrophic. The Japanese high command, humiliated that enemy bombers had struck their capital, immediately pulled critical forces from the Pacific to defend the home islands. That decision weakened Japan's operations and directly set the stage for the Battle of Midway 2 months later, where 4 Japanese carriers were lost forever. The Doolittle raid, small as it seemed, had changed the tide of the war. When the surviving raiders returned to America, they were hailed as heroes. Jimmy Doolittle received the Medal of Honor, presented by President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. But Doolittle never celebrated. He often said, "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." Every year, the surviving raiders would meet for a private toast. They would open a bottle of 25-year-old cognac, kept sealed until only the last 2 of them remained alive. As the decades passed, the chairs at their table grew fewer. The laughter faded, the voices dimmed, but the promise never changed. They had kept faith with each other. April 2013, 71 years later, the final Doolittle raiders gathered one last time in Dayton, Ohio. 4 men, all in their 90s, sat beside the silver goblets engraved with the names of their fallen brothers. They lifted one final toast to the sky. To those who gave all, may we meet again. The next year, the last raider, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, stood alone before that same table. He touched his commander's name, raised his glass, and whispered, "Mission complete." He passed away in 2019, the last of the 80. The Doolittle raid wasn't just an airstrike. It was a message to Japan, to America, to the world, that even in defeat, a nation's spirit could rise from the ashes. That courage doesn't always mean surviving. Sometimes it means flying into the unknown because it must be done. Every man who climbed into those bombers knew the odds. Yet none of them turned back. They carried not just bombs, but hope, honor, and the promise of a nation reborn. Modern Tokyo, present day. Skyscrapers now pierce the same sky that once echoed with the roar of Doolittle's bombers. The city glows with peace, commerce, and life. Proof that even enemies can heal with time. But history whispers still, in museums, in memorials, and in the hearts of those who remember. A faded black and white photo hangs in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. 16 bombers lined up on the deck of the USS Hornet, their wings wet with sea spray, their crews staring into the endless Pacific. No one knew if they would come back, and still they went. So when you hear the word impossible, remember them. 80 men flying into the unknown, armed with courage instead of certainty. Their mission began as a one-way flight, but it became the spark that lit the path to victory. History remembers their bravery. The question is, will we have the same courage when our time comes to fly into the storm?